Research has too often been done in silos, with great focus on a narrow area of expertise. But through shared knowledge and access to data, wider problems can be solved. From inequality to sustainability, from helping our ageing population to better ways of raising our children. It's that spark of an idea, disrupting what we know. By thinking differently, our behaviour will change. This research is already happening. But now there is a new home in Cardiff that brings it together. A place open to the world that celebrates and encourages innovative thinking, collaborative working, and sharing ideas. The world's first social science research park. Spark. A spark to change our futures.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Phil Swan. I'm one of the business development managers here at the CPD unit at Cardiff University. It's great to have so many of you joining us this afternoon. I can see that people are still continuing to arrive. So please just allow me just to take a moment just to welcome you and introduce you to this year's summer school. Since the start of the COVID pandemic, we've organised 2 successful years of these events. The idea came about as a way of trying to provide something useful to industry and third and public sector at a time when many conferences and face-to-face training was being cancelled. Needless to say, it was a great success. We've run it again in 2021 and then again this year. Just while we wait for people to arrive, I'm just going to go through a few housekeeping bits with you. So firstly, the session will be recorded. So this means that you'll be able to access the session and indeed the back catalogue of previous years' summer schools via the CPD unit's YouTube channel. So I recommend you take a look at that. We've got quite a broad range of previous videos available now. We're almost at the end of this year's series of live sessions, but once this finishes tomorrow, all of these will also be available on the YouTube channel. If you have any IT issues during the session, any sound issues, anything of that nature, please use the chat feature, and myself or my colleague Jess will do our very best to help you sort that out. If your Wi-Fi drops out, please reuse the link that we provided you with to access this session. Jess and I will just readmit you into the session. You won't interrupt the flow of the session or anything like that. So please just reuse that link. We are going to be doing questions and answers at the end of the session. So please just make a note of anything you'd like to ask and use the question and answers tab at the bottom of the Zoom page, and we will go through those at the end. Alternatively, if you would rather ask the question yourself rather than type it out and have me read it out for you, then at the end, please just use the raise your hand button, and we'll unmute your microphone and you can ask the question yourself. Finally, feedback. We're going to be sending out an online feedback questionnaire after tomorrow. We're really keen to identify any future sessions that might be of interest to people. So please keep an eye out for the feedback form. It only takes a few minutes to fill in, and we very much appreciate you providing us with that feedback. So I think that's enough from me. I'll hand you over to our fantastic speaker, Phil Brown. Over to you, Phil. Thanks very much.
Okay, thanks very much, Phil. Let me just share my screen. Well, afternoon, everybody, and thanks for turning out today or sitting in front of a computer somewhere to listen to this, because it's a beautiful day, and with the opportunity to watch us at any time, it's always tempting to say, I'll watch it later. But it's a pleasure to talk to you this afternoon. I've got just a little bit of background. I've got a lot of experience of really studying the future of work over 30 years, actually. And I'm currently engaged in a 7-country study funded out of Singapore, looking really at the nature of new technologies and what the likely implications are for education, economy, society, including questions around skill. And what I want to present to you this afternoon is I suppose in a way it's a different interpretation of the fourth industrial revolution, because we hear a lot about that, and there are certain sets of assumptions that kind of go with it. And I want to challenge many of those. So I want to say a little bit about what is the fourth industrial revolution. I want to look at the dominant view around automation, around the idea of what we call labor scarcity. I've kept the evidence to a minimum given time, but I just want to give some indication of the available evidence in this area, and then present an alternative view around what we call job scarcity rather than labor scarcity, before outlining some of the public policy implications around education, skills, but much more widely around really the future of society, and to raise questions ultimately about, what does it mean to be human in an age of smart machines? So that's what I'd like to cover in this particular session. So let's begin then by just saying a few words about, what is the fourth industrial revolution? I mean, it assumes that there's 3 earlier kind of revolutions, and one of the assumptions is that these are driven by sets of technologies which come together, whether it would be around steam power or electrical power in the second industrial revolution. The relationship between the third industrial revolution, which were the early days of electronics computing, and what we have today around digital and AI is a little bit blurred, and I'll mention in a moment whether we really are in the fourth industrial revolution, but that to me is not the crucial question. What we can agree on, I think, is that we have seen this coming together of technologies in terms of whether it's artificial intelligence, whether it's robotics, whether it's the Internet of Things, 3D printing, etc. There's a range of new forms of knowledge and new ways of working, which does seem to support the claim that we are in a period of something rather different. And I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. But it seems to me that it's not really about simply the production of new products and services. We like to talk about innovation in relation to new gadgets and images of robots and such things. But really, it's also about new ways of doing existing things. For example, how we teach, how we transport things, how we buy things, how we sell things. So it's how we produce things in terms of production lines and how we think about the transformation of the office. It's those things in many ways which are having a much bigger impact on the nature of skill. And so that's one of the things that a lot of our research has focused on. It's really that process innovation. And one of the intriguing aspects of process innovation, in a way, is the whole question of digital platforms. Now, we all work on platforms of one sort or another, with the apps that we use, the way we do our banking, et cetera, et cetera. And so one of the questions is, to what extent are these platforms almost like the equivalent of the production lines of the last century? And do they constitute a form of digital bureaucracy? And if they do, what does this mean for the organization of work? What does it mean for skill? Because if you think about the last century, and especially the early part of it, then the development of mass production was really the capturing of craft knowledge, and it's kind of repositioning in terms of production line, which some argue was a crucial source of productivity. So what is the source of productivity in the fourth industrial revolution? And what does that mean for work and skill? So those are the sorts of things that we're trying to grapple with currently. So whatever it is, therefore, the fourth industrial revolution is at the very early stages. And crucially, how we define it, how we understand it now, how we think about the technologies is going to have a big impact on the consequences. Because if we think that the technologies are operating in a particular way, we are likely to develop ways of running businesses, ways of thinking about public policy, which will be driven by those assumptions. But one of the most important things to note straight away is that the technology is not destiny. It doesn't predefine what's going to happen. We need to study both the areas of technological convergence and how those technologies are being used, but also divergence. And this will become clear to you as we go through this talk. And it also seems to me that we are not in some kind of unique age of invention. We hear about new gadgets and new clever things that these technologies can do. But actually, what I think we're in is an age of recombination. We're seeing the unraveling of social institutions. Many of the assumptions we've taken for granted no longer seem to be holding. We see deliberate attempts to unbundle, for example, jobs and the nature of skill in ways which are driven by some of the technologies, because we've got access to big data now, which allow us to, for example, explore labor markets in new ways. But then we've got the question of recombination. How are things brought together, and how are things that have not been brought together in the past now being reconstituted? If you think about the mechanical electronics, for example, or think about cars, and the development of electric cars is a good example of that. But also we should be very clear that industrial revolutions are never technological. They always include the social. They are about institutional restructuring. And one of the fundamental things that's being restructured is that education-work relationship. And what we're trying to do at the moment is understand the nature of that changing relationship in comparative kinds of ways. Now, my starting point here is to say, well, okay, how might we make sense of the impact of technologies on skill and the future of work? Well, there are kind of two key theories I would want to suggest to you, and these are outlined in a book that we produced not that long ago on the death of human capital. Provocative title, deliberate, and rather than say that we should kind of sound the death knell of human capital, we suggest that it should be kind of rethought. And so if you're interested in that, then that book is available. But there we talk, therefore, about this issue of labor scarcity and contrast it with job scarcity. So let's explain what we mean by labor scarcity. This will be familiar to most of you because it's consistent with that human capital view of investment in individuals as being the key to the future of work. In other words, it's people investing in themselves. It's how we organize education, crucially how we reform education, which creates for the individual this bundle of valuable human capital, of skills, of individual assets, which due to their scarcity generates a flow of income. So in other words, these are things that employers recognize as important to them to deliver productivity, and therefore they're willing to continue to pay for those skills and those experiences in the future of work. Now, that view of the supply side human capital investment is consistent with a long historical view now, certainly in terms of the last century, which is based on the idea that the more technologically advanced an economy, then the greater demand for skill. In other words, it's the technologies, the new technologies, advances in science and knowledge, which drive the demand for skill. And we've seen how, for example, the massive expansion of higher education has been driven by the idea of a knowledge economy. And it's precisely that fits into this particular labor scarcity view. So it's presented in a way like a race between education and technology. Can education keep up with the changes in the technology? Because the underlying assumption of this particular view is that economic history will repeat itself. In other words, that each industrial revolution always creates more jobs and better jobs than are destroyed by the technologies. So although there's a period of adjustment that people need to make, they need to get themselves re-skilled, the assumption is the jobs will be there. Now, within this particular approach, there are different views to automation and the extent of labor substitution. But even those claiming that nearly half of the jobs in America could be substituted by new technologies within 20 to 30 years, there was still this idea that these new jobs will be therefore created. And there's also an assumption that the technologies, if you like, they attack from the bottom up. In other words, they attack the routine, low-skilled jobs, and to some extent those in the middle of the labour market, rather than those at the top end. But in doing that, they create these new opportunities. And this quote from Brynjolfsson and McAfee, who are two leading thinkers from this particular approach, talk about this relationship between technology and human capabilities as a complementary shift towards a more productive economy, where the skills, abilities, and creativity of individuals will be used to deliver a better future. So if you take that view of the fourth industrial revolution, that it's really about the technology driving things forward and education trying to keep pace with it, then you end up with this supply reform agenda. But within that, there are some interesting aspects. For example, there are questions about what constitutes high skills. To what extent is that changing? And Levy and Murnane talk about dancing with robots. So again, that complementarity between the machine and humans, and how that changes our idea of high skills, you know, in terms of thinking around, for example, agile working. What does that mean in our terms of competences, in terms of digital skills? What does that involve? Most of the focus here is actually on the idea of humans trying to keep ahead of the robots. So in other words, thinking about what the robots, what the technology, what the AI can't do. So if it can't do the non-routine cognitive skills, the emotional kind of IQ, the emotional activities, the empathetic kind of areas of human capability, then they're the things that we should really focus on. And one of the interesting aspects to be explored here is the way in which big data is now being used to get a better understanding of changing employer needs. And across the world, we're seeing attempts to try to capture that big data, often by looking at hiring data, in other words, job adverts, and trying to understand what the companies are asking for. And by doing that, the idea is that we can get a better sense of how education and training reforms need to take place, what they should look like. And this could be now done in real time. Now, I think that there's some real possibilities there, but there are also major limitations. We haven't got time to talk about that now, but there are major limitations with that as well. And I do worry about trying to strip everything down. That unbundling process I mentioned at the beginning, the unbundling of education into a set of skills that people might need to do particular kinds of jobs. I have concerns about that kind of approach. And alongside this, of course, is this increasing focus upon STEM and the importance of digital skills. And we see this in many countries where there's talk about the need for kind of coding skills and also digital literacy and what digital literacy might look like. But a lot of this is linked with the idea of an agile workforce, of how we can move more quickly to respond to the changes of the technology. So that's really the labour scarcity view. Now, just a few comments on evidence. We are spending a lot of time working on evidence. I've got a team. I'm leading a team of over 20 researchers in Singapore and a number of other countries, including the UK and especially in Cardiff, to try to explore a lot of these issues. We're doing major interviews with employers. There's likely to be over 400 to 500 interviews in total as part of a 4-year research program. So we are trying to take this seriously and try to get a very good understanding of where we are and where we're likely to head. We've got just over a year left of that program. But what's perfectly obvious is that the early claims that have been made about the impact of mass technological unemployment were grossly exaggerated. But the direction of travel is pretty clear, because we are able to use technologies in new sorts of ways, which is likely to lead to a decline in the numbers of working hours required. How we distribute those hours is another question. And also we're likely to be working for longer, in part for reasons not because of technology, but because of the way in which we organize work, and because of, for example, the nature of pensions and the lack of money people are likely to have in later life. In terms of the job context, in terms of labour contracts, for example, we often make quite a big distinction between kind of gig jobs and regular employment. It strikes us that distinction is likely to become increasingly blurred. Part of the reason for this is because there's a growing push for companies to think about agile working within their own companies and have different kinds of contracts within the same organization, which lead that basic distinction to be open to question. So that's an important area to think about, is what is the nature of the job context and the changing employment contracts which we're likely to see over the coming decade or so. Likewise, in terms of job content, I think this is a very important part of our discussion. That the assumption that AI and automation attacks from the bottom up, that it basically replaces routine jobs and increases the demand for high skill work, is simply not supported by a lot of the evidence. Certainly not on the scale which would allow us to create what many regard as a knowledge economy, and I'll explain why that's the case in a moment. But there's also little evidence of a decline in so-called routine, less skilled jobs, because if you take basic caring roles, for instance, I mean, to automate those is actually really, really difficult and also very expensive. So companies have little incentive to actually think about how they might achieve that. So there's little evidence of that changing. There's also little evidence of a hollowing out of the middle. I don't know whether you've heard, but there's quite a lot of discussion and argument saying there's been a hollowing out of the labour market or the occupational structure. We don't find any evidence for that whatsoever. What we do find, however, is the middle is changing its character. What we regard as quasi-professional jobs very often are now increasingly in the middle of the labour market. And we're seeing more and more graduates being locked into the middle of the labour market, very different from the sorts of ideas about graduate jobs that we had in the past. And then, so that relates to the issue of graduate underemployment, and commonly find that a third of graduates not in, well, I've put high skilled jobs here just because that's what it's how it's presented in the official documentation. But that means technical, professional, and managerial, but those jobs are actually quite different, these jobs, and they actually pay very different sorts of pay rates. So that is actually quite confusing. But we already observed very significant labour market congestion before the pandemic, as well as kind of after it. By congestion, we simply mean that competition for education and competition for jobs, especially kind of good jobs. And we find this increasingly as a kind of global phenomenon. And finally, here in terms of the evidence, just to say that this idea again that today's school children went into jobs that don't exist we find also very little evidence for that. If you look at most of the jobs that are likely to be created, they are replacement jobs rather than new jobs in new fields. But that doesn't mean they're not going to be different. And I think many of these jobs will be different, but there's not somehow going to be this magical creation of large numbers of new jobs that we don't yet know about. It simply doesn't add up at all to us from the evidence that we can see. Anyway, so if we've looked at labor scarcity, how is that then different from what we're calling job scarcity? So what would this alternative view kind of look like? What's the starting point? So this is important because it offers a different lens. If job scarcity really begins with a supply side lens, in a way, if labor scarcity begins with a supply side lens, then job scarcity begins very much by looking at labor demand. Doesn't mean that skill supply side is unimportant. It is very important. But nevertheless, it starts from the assumption of what kinds of jobs are being created in terms of new technologies, and what then would be the implications for skills and education. It starts that way around. And it begins with the view that really there's a significant capacity or structural problem. So it's not a question of just simply aligning supply with demand. It's actually a question of how are we going to create enough of the sorts of jobs that people want to match in any kind of way what their expectations are or what people are qualified to do. And that's before raising issues about how people are going to be paid and about issues of wage sort of inequality. So for us, the starting point here is that one of the most fundamental challenges is how we move the economy in ways that are labor enhancing, as well as being productive. And it's linking those two things together. It's the labor enhancement and it's the productivity together. And that raises these issues about whether we adopt a kind of machine-centered view and a cost reduction view of business reorganization, or whether we have a human-centered view, because that doesn't mean we're giving up on productivity. It might well contribute to a productive organization. And as I mentioned before, at the heart of job scarcity is this question about job quality, therefore. So it's not just about whether there are job opportunities. There might be job opportunities, but a lot of those are maybe poorly paid and actually offer little in terms of skill demand. So the cognitive challenge is an aspect of this, which I'd like to draw your attention to. Because if you look at the literature, there's a lot of discussion about robotic process automation. That's quite interesting because the argument is that if you take standard office work, the robotic process automation is taking the robot out of the human and freeing up. You hear a lot about freeing up workers in order to do something more kind of interesting. But one of the great challenges is, what if there is also cognitive process automation? In other words, to what extent are forms of knowledge work being captured and automated in ways that have implications for our understanding of professional, technical, and managerial forms of work? Now, one of the things that we would want to highlight here is that we're not talking about direct labor substitution. It's not can a robot do what a teacher can do? This sort of misunderstands it. It's rather, can the process of teaching, can the process of making or doing things, can the process of banking be restructured in ways which enable the technologies to stratify or to create a segmented form of work, which means that permission to think, for example, remains, but it remains, say, with 20% of your workforce, and you try to standardize and automate much of the rest of what your activities. Now, it's those processes that we need to understand. And if we had more time, I would explain issues around talent management and why that seems to support our concerns around how work is being restructured. So here then, we're talking about this capturing of knowledge work and its translation into working knowledge. So to put this slightly differently, the assumption about the knowledge economy, the assumption about human capital is that most of the value of knowledge would remain in the heads of workers, which are then sold in the labor market. They're of value, so therefore employers will pay more. And as the economy becomes more complex, then more workers will be doing that kind of knowledge work. This completely misunderstands the nature of basically capitalist development. And you know, if you look at I mean, all industrial revolutions involve basically forms of standardization. And that's why we're particularly interested in looking at platformization. Horrible word, but it's the way in which work is increasingly located on platforms and captured in software. And then the question is, does that capture some of the knowledge and skills of what people do? Does it intensify work? And you think about your own roles, the extent to which that is actually the case or not, or not the case. And alongside this is the ways in which HR tech, one of the big advantages of this is that it's allowing for a visualization of the company and what people are doing and the ways of working, which was simply not available before. But this can be used in ways which can unbundle tasks. It can unbundle occupations. And for some companies, the holy grail here is to plug people in and plug groups of workers in to do particular things. So why have an employment model where you're just employing somebody for their time and hoping they're going to do something useful? Why don't you just try and pay for what they actually do, what they actually contribute? And this is a big and growing area of concern in terms of the future of work. And we need to keep a very close eye on these developments in HR tech and some of the assumptions around agile working, which are being developed. Because if this is the case, then the old notion of core and peripheral workforce, you know, the core full-time workforce who are high skilled, the peripheral workforce who are on temporary contracts, low skilled, that takes on a different meaning, because you can have a lot of high skilled workers, a lot of graduates who are also part of that peripheral workforce, who are being, if you like, casualized. So I think that's an important aspect of how work and its organization might be changing. So alongside this, therefore, is the whole question of, to what extent are we seeing the re-stratification of managerial, professional and technical jobs? In other words, as I mentioned before, to what extent, if companies, so for example, if companies work on the assumption that most of the value is created by the top 20%, where do you put your efforts? You put your efforts in that top 20%, you try and identify them early, you invest in them heavily, and you reward them highly. What you also do is you're likely to say, well, okay, well, if they add the value, then let's use the technologies to enhance the value of that 20%, and let's then try to standardize and automate everything else. So again, how we understand the nature of technology and its relationship to labor is crucial, because if we adopt a different view, if rather than a war for talent, top 20%, if we have a wealth of talent view, which actually values the contribution across your workforce, then you're likely to use technologies in a different way. And for us, that's the challenge of how do we get companies to actually think differently about how they might use the technologies beyond simply short-term cost-cutting kinds of ways of reorganizing. Now, I've got things I could say about the consultancy companies and how they are presenting some of this. but we'll leave that perhaps to questions. So implications for public policy. As I mentioned, whatever we're doing, it's the early phases of the fourth industrial revolution, if that's what it is. And how we think about it is going to be very, very important in shaping the direction of change. At the moment, I think many of us and many politicians are going in with their eyes closed, and that's not a good thing. We really need to put this analysis on the agenda, and there are companies, and I would say that unlike some of our other work, which I think we've had to struggle a little bit in terms of getting people to really understand why it's significant and important. We've had no problem in getting companies that we've worked and senior managers that we've worked with to actually recognize that there is something fundamentally wrong, that there is a problem that we need to try to resolve today, because if we don't, things are going to get even more difficult than what they are. So in thinking about this early phase, then, the argument that I'd want to make is we need to think both about a labour scarcity, but crucially a job scarcity view, and see this not simply as an alignment problem, but as a structural problem. That so-called race between education and technology, which has always been a little bit dodgy in a way, that is now very much in reverse. Equally, much of our thinking about productivity and the productivity model, we often hear, don't we, that oh, we just need to raise productivity and therefore everything will be all right, as if that's like there's a mechanism, a kind of economic law that underpins it. So the technological innovation leads to higher skills, which leads to higher productivity, which leads to higher wages. Well, that has unraveled very, very significantly. And I think that what we need to think much more about is how do we work with companies and also public sector organizations as well. Not simply to invest in technologies, but it's how they invest in the technologies, the kinds of technologies that they invest in. Because if it's simply transactional AI, then it is not likely to be good news for labor. If it's relational, in the sense that it takes seriously social relations and is more human-centered, then the consequences might be different. Now, in transactional AI, companies might make cuts to costs in the short term, but it could have a negative impact on productivity over the medium to long term. So we shouldn't assume that human-centered approaches means a decline in productivity, because in our view, it certainly doesn't. Again, Gary Becker was one of the leading exponents of human capital theory, for which he got a Nobel Prize. And he argued that in the latter part of the 20th century that we were entered an age of human capital. And that's largely been accepted by a lot of people. But there's been no real power shift towards knowledge workers. The capital, material capital, financial capital continues to trump labor in many ways, and almost regardless how qualified much of that labor is. And we see these extreme forms of inequality, which seem to bear very, very little relationship to individual productivity or performance. And during the pandemic, I mean, it's quite striking. There's been a whole number of these sorts of figures available, but during the pandemic, it was reported that America's 651 billionaires increased their wealth by over $1 trillion. And this was the early stages of the pandemic. And globally, the 10 richest men received more than 400 billion, while many people were kind of furloughed or joined the sort of destitute. So there is something fundamentally wrong. And one of the things that has gone wrong is that the value of labor, the value of our skill, the very opposite of what we assumed about human capital, seems to have been taking place. For example, many people, for example, in the Southeast, have probably made more money from owning property, their homes, than what they have through their waged work. So there are things that we need to resolve, because how is this going to pan out for the younger generation in terms of thinking about the future of work and what they do? So one of the concerns that we have then is around this idea of productivity capture, that a lot of the productivity gains are being captured by those at the top of organizations. But at the same time, there is a paradox, because if you think about the ways in which we produce and kind of make and create things, then the technology allows for the distributed means of production. Now, in terms of what can be done, like, for example, the shift to working from home, the very fact that we can actually engage in this conversation remotely in this sort of way is because of the distributed means of basically communication, and therefore of production. But we seem to have not taken seriously so far, in my view, what a bottom-up economy might look like. And I argued this when I was chairing a review for the Welsh Government on the future of digital and future of work. And I still think that we've got a long way to go to think about how might we really work through a distributed model of this, especially related to green technology and net zero. So the argument in relation to skill, therefore, is that the standard view of skills upgrading is simply not going to resolve the ways in which the so-called opportunity bargain around learning and earning has unraveled. And we are seeing greater social congestion, as I said, both in the labour market, but also in the workplace, and the competition for good jobs, competition for promotion, that is not going to go away. We have a slightly strange situation at the moment post, well, it's not post-COVID, but at this stage in the pandemic, which alongside Brexit and alongside the war is actually leading to some very interesting, but I think perhaps short-term issues around labour. But we'll see how that really pans out. But we need to really think about what an alternative opportunity bargain might now kind of look like. Because if we take the analysis of the future of work and technology seriously, and if we take seriously the idea that over time, at least AI and other related technologies will become increasingly smarter, then the underutilization of human talents, which is also true today, should be seen to be the norm. So the idea that we're totally consumed by our work in terms of our talents and abilities is far removed from the reality of how most people work and what most people are capable of. So we need to think about what are the alternative forms of expression of our capabilities outside of wage work as well as within wage work. So alongside the question of improving the quality of work is this broader question of the nature of human life, which is positive and constructive rather than simply downtime that we currently assume today, because we assume that most of our creative activity is absorbed within the workplace. And that relates to the question of whose needs of industry should be served and for what purpose, because the ways in which the analytics, labour market analytics is often used is to say, well, look, this gives us a better way of understanding what employers need. But one, employers are really, really bad at defining what they need. They change very rapidly, much quicker than the educational training system can change. So what is it? What's at the core? What is the core of, if you like, what makes us human? What's important within human society? So it's not just, so education, training, and all the rest of it is not just about how about students and workers being active agents for their own work-life journeys and making those a success and satisfying. But it's also about how do we equip people to shape this different future of society, and in a context of increasing fake news. What's the knowledge base? What's the aspects of digital literacy, therefore, that's required for us to really have a sustainable way forward, both within the labour market and beyond it? And that really is a question about what does it mean to be human. And for me, having done a lot of work on human capital theory from an economics perspective, orthodox economic perspective, then I think putting the human back into human capital is actually very important. And there are two very clear ways we can go. If we go for the route where we think that most of the value is added at the top end, then we can see how, in a context of increasingly smarter technologies, we allow the technologies to make the decisions for us. So we just have a set of functioning skills which allow us to do tasks which is required by companies, or required whether you work in the public or private sector, which in many ways is a dumbing down process. Or we can think about these sources of collective intelligence, of how we're going to work collectively using our skills alongside the technologies, which are designed with that human-centric view very much in mind. So this is a very big agenda, which is very difficult for governments to get their heads around. It's difficult for companies also to think about how they might do things differently. But some of them are thinking very much about what the implications of a lot of this actually are. Because we're not actually talking here about the end of work. We're not talking about the age of leisure. Particularly, I'm not convinced by the end of work arguments, but I am convinced that the labour market cannot resolve the distribution issues of who does what and who gets what. So the focus just on, for example, social mobility as equivalent to opportunity and fairness is inadequate. Do we need to think about equality of opportunity? Yes, we do. But we also need to think about equality of condition. We need to think about the quality of the lives that we lead. We need to think about the quality of education that everybody gets. We need to think about the quality of activities, including waged work, which give everybody a meaningful life. So it seems that certainly in the short to medium term, certainly in medium term, then some version of flex security, which is sometimes used in Europe and certainly in Scandinavia, and some notion of a basic income, or this can take many different forms, and something which has been widely debated and discussed. These seem to be something that we will not be able to avoid. But I'll throw in one caveat here, and that is to beware of social credits. In other words, if we say, well, okay, we'll give everybody a basic income, but providing you behave yourself. In other words, it'll be linked to social norms of behavior, which if you don't behave, you don't get your basic income. Now, that might sound far-fetched, but it's actually very close to the kinds of social credits that's already being used in places like China. And it's something we have to be very mindful of, I think. So how this plays out, how this whole agenda kind of plays out is going to vary across different countries. And so I think what I've been calling for is a major international effort to try to systematically understand this fourth industrial revolution, but along the lines which I've discussed, rather than, for example, along the lines of the World Economic Forum, some of which I agree with, but much of it I would take issue with. And And so the arguments around human capital is, in a way, we would want to argue, not just about the death of an idea, but it's a fight for the kinds of future that we want, the future of education, the future of work, and the wider society. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much for that fascinating presentation, Phil. I don't know if anyone's got any questions, if they wanted to use the Q&A tab now to post their question through text, or if anyone would like to sort of put their question to Phil via the raise hand tab, and we can open your mic up. I don't know if anyone would like to put a question up. We'll just wait a few moments, Phil, just to see if anyone comes forward. Oh, there's one's just come through from Holly. That was really great. I want to go back to the start and listen again. And sink everything in. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to take in. I think the fact that the future of work touches into all aspects of society and us as individuals, you know, how we spend our time and how wealth is distributed, all those things. So I think there's a lot to take on board. You can go back and listen again, Holly. We'll be putting these videos on YouTube, so you'll be able to watch them again and also share them with any colleagues or friends that you might have that you think might be interested. Phil, is there any particular resources or any web pages or anything? At
the end, that last page, let me stick it up again. On that last, at the bottom there, that's the website for the current research program, and we're trying to get we're trying to get somebody at the moment to work with us on developing that. We've got some blogs and some papers and things, but we're trying to get more, a broader range of people involved in the debate. I've been engaged in some discussions with the International Labour Organization, who are very interested in what we're doing. But the more people we can get involved, the better. But I understand what Holly's saying, because it is it's quite a broad-ranging agenda, but I think it needs to be, because we can't simply look at this from a skills or an educational perspective. We need to understand that that broader context. And so for me, I think the challenge I've had for a long time is how do you communicate the complexities of what's kind of going on, without doing too much kind of violence to the actual complexity itself and the nature of the issues. Let me see, broader range. Yeah, I do. I mean, I again, when I was doing the review for Welsh Government, one of the things I've really argued for is this cannot be top down. We cannot have this debate top down. This cannot be one just about policymakers just being informed by experts about what we need to do. These impact everybody in different kinds of ways. So we need a very much a public conversation. And I would personally extend this discussion about ethics around privacy in relation to AI. I would extend that, because it seems to me there's also key questions about how the future of work is likely to be shaped and who's benefiting from that. I mean, because we always talk about the technologies as being positive sum. And the reason why they're positive sum is because the assumption is the technologies are applied, that takes out routine activities, it creates new activities, which are higher value. That's good for labor, right? But if it's the case that the good jobs are themselves being restructured, it means that the productive value of what those well-paid workers would have received is then going elsewhere. Now, that's an ethical question about the nature of how we organize work. It's about the nature of productivity. It's about who does what and what we want to value in a society. So yes, I think that's very much a public debate. It can't just be for kind of policymakers. But how we do that is really, really difficult, and I accept that that's a real challenge.
Do you think the sort of political system and the process of elections and whatnot is sort of adequate to have those conversations? And because obviously, if they come in 5-yearly cycles, and obviously a lot of this stuff is moving quite rapidly, you know, I don't know if it's potentially adaptive enough for people to sort of have a bottom-up say in many of these issues.
I think it can. I mean, I don't think we should be abandoning our 5-year election cycle, despite the problems that it has. But what it means is there has to be some kind of more medium to longer term independent capacity that's available to governments to understand the issues. And I think one of the biggest problems for the politicians is that they don't really understand the issues. I mean, they're constantly looking for initiatives. What can I say about X, Y, Z? What can we present of what we're doing to resolve it, rather than having a sustained, for example, industrial policy? And I think that's particularly problematic in the UK and the Welsh context as well. Whereas I think in some other countries that there's much more of a sense of what an integrated approach might look like. I mean, everybody's struggling with this, and I think one of the things that I would want to say is that there's huge amounts of uncertainty. So the idea that for example, the companies have a good understanding of what's going on. Now they're also struggling with making sense of a lot of this.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Phil. I don't think we've got any other questions on the Q&A, so I think that almost takes us exactly to our time.
Yep, excellent.
So I think that finally leaves me just to say thank you very much for that really interesting, thought-provoking presentation. And as we mentioned a moment ago, we can you will be able to watch it on YouTube. So yeah, appreciate there's a lot to take on there. A lot to think about, so please feel free to rewatch that if you would like to. So thanks very much, Phil. Thank you very much.
Pleasure. Thanks everybody for turning up on a very nice day. All right, see you.
Cheers. Thanks very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye now. Bye.